now was the Department of Communication. I had very little interest in politics and very little interest in anything outside of my field, which was rhetoric and public address. And public address was a kind of way of studying history where you would look at public statements and through that get a feeling of public thought, sentiments, feelings, attitudes. It was a way of examining how people were thinking at a given time. And my study was American public address, French, British, almost everything but something in this part of the country. My dissertation was written on Edmund Burke and the public argument over the reform of the East India Company. So I was, in subject matter, a long way from anything that was dealt with here. But when I came here, it was clear to me that I was in the middle of public argument that was important. And so I started paying attention to that, reading carefully the newspapers, listening to the speeches, going places. And I got involved, first of all, with Joan Bifus and Dave Yellen, Carolyn Yellen, and the Memphis Search for Meaning. That was an organization that gathered materials during the strike, materials that are now in the University of Memphis Library, materials that have been the basis of every single piece of research and film that has come out of that strike. The first book to come out of it was Joan Bifus's At the River I Stand, and so on. Anyway, I got involved with them. And what they were interested in really was, for me, was to pay special attention to the rhetoric, to the speaking that was going on, particularly the messages from the mayor and the city government to the people and through the two daily newspapers. So I did a study for them called The Climate of Violence, the 1968 sanitation worker strike, a case study in the rhetoric of the establishment, and I finished that in this study in 1970, and I put that in their collection, so that's been in the University of Memphis libraries, and people have looked at that, and since then I've done a few other things in terms of publicizing the strike and so on. But in the process of all this, my function as a scholar changed to where I became a partisan in the strike. First of all, an active advocate for discussions between the workers and the city, and secondly, an advocate for giving the workers what they asked for, which was a secure union. So I got involved that way, and after that I got politicized and also developed a little bit of a social conscience to the point where I'm more and more comfortable now in being a Methodist. So but anyway, I'll take you back to that bad day on April 3rd, 1968. My wife, Becky, and daughter, Julie, and son, Matt, and other son, Paul, was in Huntsville, Alabama. He was busy today. We were on our way down to Midtown to pick up a table that a kitchen table from some homeowner down there. And it was April 3rd, and I felt the next day I was supposed to go to Chicago to a professional meeting. And we didn't want to go because it was 2 weeks after the riot here. The next day was going to be another mass march. I had never experienced any kind of tension and polarization in a city before. I was convinced more violence was going to happen, and I didn't like to leave town. But anyway, we went down there, and right before we left, it was about 5:30, and I said, let's wait a minute. I want to catch the national news, see if they've done anything on our local situation, which they didn't cover until Martin Luther King came to town. Anyway, Martin Luther King was there in the speech at Mason Temple when he said, I too, longevity has its place. I too would live a long life. He went on with, but I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory, and so on. And I stopped for a minute and I said, this is really an extraordinary person. And I felt pretty good that I really had sensed that. And then we were driving down and we heard the sirens and cars going here and there, and we discovered he'd been shot. And then came home and got the actual news about the death. And again, the surprise to me and to many people in the city, perhaps many of you who were there, was that it really wasn't a surprise, because at that point, it seemed like violence was necessary. Some terrible thing was necessary before people would start dealing with the issues in a more reasonable way to get things back on track. And that violence could have been the assassination of the mayor, it could have been another fire somewhere, wherever it was in the air. Well, in the process then of going back and trying to look where that started, I want to make 6 points. The first point is the strike was a big deal. It was not a little labor dispute, but it was a major event the moment it happened. Secondly, the public was given a picture of the strike that was distorted and incomplete. That is pretty well confirmed by anyone who's looked at it, but 10 years ago, Otis Sanford, in the commercial appeal called Setting the Record Straight 40 Years Later, he set it straight indeed, and how irresponsible and unprofessional and downright wrong was the way the strike was covered by the commercial appeal and the press scimitar. Early in the strike, the city government, the press scimitar, and the commercial appeal sang out of the same book. They all gave the same version of the strike. When the commercial appeal this year, or within this last year, gave an account of, or showed some of its best headlines and historic headlines, some of you probably remember that deal. They called me and they asked if I could find them a headline of the assassination. And I said, I just gave all my papers, and I had every one of them. I just donated them all to the University of Memphis Library about 2 weeks before then. So I said, there's where you find them. But anyway, in those papers, the commercial appeal gave the high point of its coverage. It also gave the low point, and the low point was the coverage of the strike. So what I'm telling you isn't news. A third point is that the leadership of the city, the papers, did not shift their position on the strike until after the strike became a civil rights strike and after Martin Luther King was coming to town. The fear was they did not want to see Memphis appear to the nation as a racist city. They did not want it to appear as another Little Rock or Birmingham or Montgomery or Selma or some city that had been associated with racial strife. And they shifted their positions radically from those that they initially recommended. Next, the strike was extended beyond the point where everybody wanted it stopped, almost everybody in the inner circles wanted it stopped, by Mayor Henry Loeb. I knew the mayor, knew Henry Loeb. I worked with him on a couple occasions. I keep going back and reviewing the history of the strike. I don't like to point fingers. I'm not interested in heaping blame, but he was primarily concerned with his image as someone who would stand for law and order, who wouldn't deal with enemies, who wouldn't break on principle. Mayor Loeb's position on his image was basically this. In winning the 1967 election with the theme, "Be Proud Again," Loeb stressed he would cut spending, especially in public employees' budget, and stand firm against any civil disorder or demonstration like those that had occurred recently in riot-torn urban areas and college campuses. As a recent independent who said both major political parties were too liberal for him, Loeb made it clear that mandates to integrate at all deliberate speed meant as slowly as legally possible. On July 13, 1957, for example, he was quoted as saying, "I favor continued segregation of the races in public schools and all areas where desegregation would result in violence, or really even the hint of violence." And he said, "I will exhaust all legal means to prevent desegregation." So his position was about as antithetical to Martin Luther King as it possibly could be. King tried to use nonviolent demonstration to raise tensions so people would look at the issue. But in the process of raising tensions, there was always the risk of violence, and then sometimes the consequence of actual violence. So we had one person who was going to do everything to keep things as they were as long as there was some hint of disruption, and another who was willing to create tensions in order to get social change. Point 5 is that Martin Luther King was at a low point personally and as a social reformer at that time when he returned to Memphis. Again, that is not a subject of speculation anymore. It was clear to most people who studied it then. But now in recent books like Tavis Smiley's Death of a King, or Tyson's book, April 4th, the Taylor Branch trilogy on civil rights, all of those books, they all stress that Martin Luther King was, not only his back was against the wall, but the walls were closing in on him at that particular time. And he really had no choice but to return to Memphis, even though he was advised by many people not to return, as he would advise by many people not to come in the first place. And my final point, if I have time, which is a happy one, I really think we've made a lot of strides since 1968. And I know that's will be being debated now, and there's lots of cases that can be made that we haven't. But looking back over those times, reading what was said during those times, listening, I think Memphis really has a lot to be humbly proud of, as long as it acknowledges clear mistakes, not apologizes anymore for them, but it acknowledges them at least. Going back to point 1, it's a big deal when somebody doesn't show up for work. It's a big deal when somebody doesn't show up for work. If you've got a number of people who work for you, if 4 or 5 people, when they show up, it's a big deal. Don't show up. When 1,300 African-American sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1968 don't show up for work, that's a big deal. That is something that there's no clear model for. What do we do now except force? You've got to have some sympathy for the city government at that time and the people who were in positions of having to make decisions and know how to respond when that happens. And in case you haven't thought about it for a while, the unionization of public employees is also a big deal. We had 4 major candidates for mayor in 1967. I think if any one of those 4 had said, I want to unionize public employees, they would have been more popular if they had been for forced school busing. Unions are not popular in this city. Southern public employees unions in the South were rare in 1968. The unionization of public employees is big throughout the nation, but not in the South. And the National Union, AFSCME, knew that if they could get a union in Memphis, they would open up the whole South to unionization. So there's going to be resistance to unions, unionization of public employees. I think if we'd have voted on it in Memphis, it had to lose 7 or 8 to 1 at least among the people that thought about it for a while. So it's very unpopular, and it means it's a transfer of power. And if Frederick Douglass once said, power doesn't accede without a demand. I mean, no one was going to say, okay, you can have the union now, without some sort of demand. And I don't know how the strikers could have, or the sanitation workers could have made the demand strong enough for anybody to hear without striking. So what I'm kind of saying is that was a big deal, a big change, a shift in power, and there was going to be some disruption of some kind at that time, no matter who was in charge of city government. And the last point that made it a big deal was that the essential demand of the workers was for a secure union. It was for money, it was for better working conditions, but it basically was, we want a union, and we want a secure union, which means it has some source of predictable revenue. So that's not compromisable. I mean, you can't compromise that. They either get one or they don't. And so seeing the government representing the public was so much against the union, and the workers were committed to that union, the issue was not going to be settled by reason alone. It was going to be settled by force, by which side could apply and withstand the most pressure. So what I'm again saying is there probably was no way that anybody could have prevented what happened given the circumstances in 1968, but there were different ways of dealing with it. All right, moving on. How was the strike presented? I was fortunate during that period that there was in this neighborhood in the St. Louis Catholic Church a program set out so people could learn about what was going on in the issues. One night was set aside so Mayor Loeb and his administration could come and present their case to whoever was at that meeting. The other night, the union was given the opportunity to do the same thing. Those two meetings were set up by my late good friend, Monsignor Paul Clunan. And we talked much about it later, and he said that was all he thought he could do. I don't know how many people were at those meetings. Probably not more than a couple hundred. There was no news coverage of them. I didn't know of any other than went on in the city. But we listened very carefully to Bill Lucy of the National Union make the case. And he made the same case that many of you heard the sanitation workers made a few weeks ago. He talked about the workers that had been killed. He talked about the black workers that were sent home when it rained while the white workers stayed and got paid. He talked about the rainwear, the salary, all the things that were so clear indications that the people probably did need better working conditions. Of the people that heard the two meetings, I don't know who was there, how many minds were changed, but I am convinced that those people would not have taken a hard line in the strike, that they would have been sympathetic, at least to the workers, and would not have taken the line that became popular in the city. And my feeling has always been, if the city as a whole had been to that meeting, there would have been communication and a less chance of the kind of clash that actually occurred. When Mayor Loeb came to that meeting, and that was the first time I personally met him, he had the same things to say as I had been reading in the papers and seeing a little bit on television. He said, number one, that he was going to solve that strike in 3 days. He said, just don't worry about it. I'll have the men back to work in 3 days. I thought, well, I'm not going to make a connection. Secondly, he said the strike was illegal. It was, as interpreted by Chancellor Robert Hoffman. If you were public employees, you couldn't strike. It was illegal. What they were going to do to you, I don't know. They couldn't throw you in jail for not saying, I'm not going to pick up garbage today. They could fire the workers. They could have fired them. But public employee, no strike laws are kind of hard to enforce. But it was illegal by Tennessee law interpretation, and Loeb said that he could not deal with illegality. He said, so he said that he would not talk to the men until they went back to work. He would have no discussions, or he would be dealing with illegality. He also said, with the country and riots at the time and disorder on college campuses, that he would not reward disorder. So on the one hand, he won't talk to you until you go back to work. When he talks to you, he won't reward you because you got him back to the table by disorder. So basically, that was his stand, and that's pretty much the one he kept, even beyond the point where he wanted to change it. The final point he made, and I'll just read you a couple of things. Here are some actual words. The strike is illegal and you can't deal with illegality. I feel we should go by the law. We will see that all laws are obeyed. Nothing will gain by ignoring our law. I intend to do my duty, and these men are going to have to decide quickly whether they want to perform this work while we talk about their questions, or whether we are forced to take other means to protect public health. And here is what I'm quoting now from a public letter that he printed in the press scimitar to the sanitation workers, so all those that took the press scimitar would be able to read it, and as well as the rest of us. He said, in fairness, I should remind you that some of the regular jobs have been filled and others are being filled daily. Your jobs are of the utmost importance to you and to your family, and I am sincerely interested in your welfare. In the context of all this, there was another strike going on. There was a strike in New York City. It had happened right before our strike began. It lasted 10 days. As you can imagine, being in New York City, if you watched the national news, you would have seen the garbage piling up every day on TV. Generally, the public in New York, across the nation, were very much against the strikers in the New York strike. They were striking for higher wages. The mayor of New York City at the time, John Lindsay, said, I'm not giving into this. He called to the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, to help me out, bring in the National Guard to pick up garbage. Instead of doing that, Rockefeller found a way to solve that strike, and the workers got a big raise in New York City, and Rockefeller and the unions were criticized by liberals and conservatives all over the country. Mayor Loeb said, the cause of this strike is the New York strikers. They're trying to be like New Yorkers. New Yorkers got away with this. They want to get away with this. We can't let them have this happen. Both newspapers agreed with that position, and every article, every editorial in the papers through the whole period was praise of Lindsay and damning Rockefeller for the strike. Loeb kept repeating, "This is not New York, this is Memphis, and nothing will be gained by ignoring our law." But I'm just going to quote you a little editorial by Max Lerner, who is liberal, about that strike and about politics at the time. Lerner said, "Lindsay and not Rockefeller had demonstrated the kind of leadership America wanted. They wanted leaders more symbolic than managerial. They wanted to stop feel like the passive victims of forces beyond their control. They want someone to stand against inevitability. Stand against inevitability. Someone who will assert themselves as they feel they are asserting themselves." And the example they gave of the right kind of politician was Calvin Coolidge and how he handled the 1918 Boston police strike. He said Coolidge was not as a Puritan in Babylon, but in the guise of Teddy Roosevelt, roaring like a bull moose, ready to stand at Armageddon and battle for the Lord. Henry Loeb, I think, read that article. I think any politician would read that article, and so that's what he was doing. And he was backed up by virtually all the main media in the city, by the business community, by leaderships from many groups. So that was the climate. Of course, there was very similarity between the New York strike and the Memphis strike. New York had had a union, and it was a strong union. The New York, they were focusing on wages. In Memphis, the focus was not on wages, it was on a union itself. It was on collective bargaining. Loeb argued that the men would be better off working individually with him and coming to his office on Thursday afternoons if they had a problem. And he said a union would not be good for them. And he told the men that it would not be good for you to have a union. He didn't argue really with the city that it wouldn't be good for the city to have a union. But he told directly the men it wouldn't be good for you to have a union. He told them that in person, and they booed him. And after that, they came out with a slogan, and that slogan was, "I am a man." And that had to do with, it's up to me to decide whether it's good to have collective bargaining or deal personally with you. It's my choice and not yours. And ultimately, the public began to agree with that. But that is where the "I am a man" began in a very, very specific, concrete situation. Now the strike went on, and without much change. Obviously, the public had, the city had underestimated the men's strength. They weren't back to work in 3 days. When it became a civil rights issue, that is when both newspapers shifted their positions, as well as the business community leaders. Memphis, as I said, did not want to appear as another a Little Rock or whatever. When Roy Wilkins first came to town, who was considered the most moderate of the civil rights leaders at that time, he was head of the NAACP. When Bayard Rustin came to town, the message from the press was, tell the men to go back to work. Tell them what's good for them. And their message to the men was, stay there till hell freezes over. And then when Martin Luther King was coming to town, then there was a real shift. It was a surprise to me, being a recent citizen of this community, to discover not simply how widespread the hate was for Martin Luther King, but the fear of him. And it was hard for me to understand it because I didn't live in this part of the country. But the fear that was of him was something I hadn't seen before. And this was a time when Stokely Carmichael and the Rap Browns and Black Power and Malcolm X and while King was associated with nonviolence, but no, that distinction wasn't made. Anyway, here's quickly what the papers were saying. Commercial appeal, Press Scimitar, March 20. The time has come for a real all-out, all-night effort to bring the strike to an end. Ending the strike is of great importance. April 1st, after King had been here. Concessions must be made on both sides to end the walkout, even though it's not legal. In the same edition, the Commercial Appeal highlighted a letter implying that King was a liar and a communist, reported that he was staying in an expensive $29 a day per room at the luxurious Holiday Inn Rivermont, noted that he had slept late, and reprinted an editorial from the Dallas Morning News. The editorial called King a headline-hunting high priest of nonviolent violence, a press agent protester, a marching militant willing to wreck everything for a spot on the evening news, a peripatetic preacher who could not allow the troubled waters to go unfished. If there was a chance, the fisher would pick up a little publicity. And that's the beginning of what I could read to you. But as far as the issue itself, on Memphis and civil rights, on the eve of the anticipated March 22nd demonstration, the Press Scimitar ran the headline, "Memphis braces itself for King March." On the front page, the press printed an editorial entitled, "We're not ashamed of Dr. King," warning King about ruining the Memphis race relations record, what they call the best of any city in America. While there was much to be proud of in the Memphis peaceful and at times progressive record in race relations and integration, the Press Scimitar chose to include in the list of accomplishments the fact that, number one, when they had charity, they included black people in some of their charity. And they also told us that when they named an all-city athletic team, they had black people named as part of their all-city team. This is what they pointed out to us as evidences of having the best race relations record in the nation. The strike got hung up on the issue of how the union was going to get its dues. The union needed a way of securing its dues, and the men, it was proposed that the city deduct their dues from their paychecks and give it directly to the union. Loeb said he could not allow that to happen. He said it would be immoral for him and against the public will for them to deduct union dues. The union had to collect its own dues. And finally, when the pressure was getting stronger, someone suggested, well, why don't you take the dues and check them off to their credit union? Then their credit union can give the dues to the union. And then you wouldn't be directly giving them the dues. Loeb agreed with that. And Otis Stanford briefly mentioned it when he was here. He agreed with that. Someone in the Commercial Appeal reported the next day in the paper the headline that Loeb had compromised. When he saw that headline, he changed his position and told them to write back or put in the papers that he had not changed his position. And so the strike went on until after the assassination, after a riot, after the assassination, when the city then agreed with that very same provision that the dues would go to the credit union and then to the union. A month after that, they threw that away and they just deducted and went straight for the union. The story was somewhere on page 10 and nobody seemed to care. But it was that, and that decision to, the word compromise is what prolonged the strike. And there's testimony to that effect all through the Memphis Search for Meaning group of people that were present at that meeting, and I cite one of them who passed away recently, Lewis Donaldson, who was one person who testified that that's exactly what happened. So that's the fact that was just there. Now, as far as King's position in all this, Martin Luther King at the time, well, see, one other thing, Loeb's method of survey at that time was he'd report he got 307 favorable letters, 42 unfavorable from out of town, and 14 favorable locally. And a later survey said he got 1,117 favorable telegrams and 10 opposed on his positions on this. And another, he said, people were 9-1 in the city of Memphis in favor of his positions, determined mainly by the mail that he received. There were no surveys taken during that of anything. So that's how he was gauging public opinion. But actually, in one way, I felt kind of sorry for him because he was out there on that limb, and all the people in the papers and the leaders in the city that pushed him out there left him there when they decided to strike. Okay, let's forget about all this now and settle the strike. But on the other hand, he could have settled it. Martin Luther King at this time, and I'm going to read this, at this time was criticized. He had opposed the war in Vietnam. The Johnson administration was enraged with that. He was ready to have a Poor People's March, which is the business leadership and liberal newspapers around the country didn't want that to happen. Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power people were saying that nonviolence doesn't work. And everyone was telling him to please don't get yourself involved in Memphis. All such criticism came to a peak after King's march in Memphis on behalf of the sanitation workers when it was disrupted by violence. The criticism came from all over, from the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as the Atlanta Constitution, the Dallas Morning News, and yes, the Commercial Appeal and Press Scimitar. Respectively, in editorials entitled King's Credibility Gap, that came from the Commercial Appeal, and Chicken a la King, which came from the Press Scimitar. The Commercial Appeal too. The Commercial Appeal, for example, said, King's pose as the leader of a nonviolent movement has been shattered. The real Martin Luther King is one of the most menacing men in America today. The Press Scimitar said King's rhetoric has lost its spell. And I've already quoted you the Dallas Morning News. You can imagine what was being said on the street at the time. From all corners, the message was clear. Martin Luther King, go home, go back where you came from, get back in your place. At worst, you're dangerous. At best, you're history. Believe me, James Earl Ray was not the only American who wanted King out of the way. But Martin Luther King had to return to Memphis, mindful of the difficulties before him and the risks he would be taking. Like Socrates at his trial, like Jesus at Gethsemane, like his namesake Martin Luther King at Worms. King had to reassert himself when it mattered most to himself in the world in which he lived. His image as a powerful agent for justice was undergoing a crucifixion and demanded resurrection. On the eve of April 4th, in such a climate of violence that was Memphis, Martin Luther King delivered his mountaintop speech at Memphis Temple, like Socrates at his trial. Socrates had told his accusers he would rather die living as he did than living the way they wanted him to. Jesus had asked the Lord to remove the cup, but pledged to go on if it be his will. Luther, when asked to recant his writings, had said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And King said, "I too would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I only want to do God's will. And God has allowed me to go up to the mountaintop, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And here we are, 50 years later, looking back at a situation where a problem was, first of all, not really understood, Secondly, where communication in our institutions didn't give us the real story, where people were defensive, very defensive about their racism or their history, where stubbornness and the desire to maintain an image of be sure to put in it that I don't compromise, and where a person was put in a position where he had to take risks to increase, to maintain the viability of nonviolence as the means of social change as opposed to violence. It was the viability of nonviolence that was at stake as far as King was concerned. And he had to come back in order to make that work. I think we've made a lot of progress because I don't recognize a lot of this stuff going around as clearly as it did then. I also believe that we need to start taking some pride in our accomplishment, in the things that are good, because that's what keeps us going. I think we should celebrate this occasion, and the fact that we are celebrating is itself a sign of real progress. But some of this stuff is so unreal that it's hard to believe that it happened. It's hard to believe we progressed from something that we can't believe happened in the first place. So, but it did. It did happen. Anyway, I didn't advocate certainly communication, whatever, wouldn't have solved this, but it would, I think, have prevented the worst from happening. I talked a little longer than I wanted to. I'm sorry.
Are there questions for Dr. Bakke? Any? I pass this on.
Oh, sure. To work to unionize the rest of the South, and I said, yes, they did.
And were they successful?
Yes.
And Dr. Bakke, do you know how much money the sanitation workers got in their settlement? And is it what King had asked for?
King didn't ask for any money. Oh, they got a few dollars. They just got a few dollars.
An hour?
Yeah, an hour. If it's that, I can find the answer, but it was not much money. And King did not ask for money. When I heard back then people talking about that, it was easy to make a case for the workers. When this Loeb made the case, he would talk about can't break the law, but he had no information about what was going on in the city. He would just repeat again and again and again. And I asked him a question. I asked him, I said, what do you think about the principle of a living wage, which is kind of the standard now the state is using, and it's mentioned by the city, and it's getting into the present dispute with the fast food workers and so on. Anyway, what do you think of the living wage? Because many of the workers were in poverty in spite of the fact they were working full time. And he told me, he says, I believe in America. And I said, I do too. And then he said, I believe in democracy. And I said, I do too. And then he said, I believe in the freedom of speech. And I said, I do. And we went on like this. It kept getting louder. But no information, just law, freedom of speech, and so on. Loeb believed in freedom of speech. He would tell you, you have a right to your opinion, and then he'd walk away. Well, first of all, I don't know who started the riot. Secondly, I do know the invaders were a local group. I know one of them is a ranking official now in the Department of Tourism in Memphis. Another is a professor somewhere. And I know others. But the one that's in the tourist department, I remember many years ago talking to him about the whole incident. And he said when the first march happened, it was hastily put together by Jim Lawson, Reverend Jim Lawson. And they didn't include any of the kids in it. They didn't let them in. And they were mad. And the second time, King insisted that there be workshops in marching and that these young men would come in. And this person told me, he said, we were all ready to meet, all ready to talk to Dr. Martin Luther King. And he said, he walked in the door and we melted. He said, we just melted. But that was a local group it didn't connect with anybody.
As far as the march?
Yeah. Yeah, he would include them, yes. But I don't know, that was so tense in those marches. And the police had no experience in dealing with them. Most people in the marches had no experience being in the march. And there was tension, and those police were hitting those. And all it took was a rock and chaos. And of course, King was blamed for not staying to stop the march, to stop the violence, as if anybody could have at that point. In point of fact, he stayed 7 minutes by the police report, 7 minutes into the riot. He was taken out of the situation by the late Dr. Vasco Smith and also the late Dr. Reverend Ralph Jackson. And I know both those men, and both of them told me the story that he actually wanted to stay. And they said, we cannot, we can't risk this. We can't let you get hurt. But no, he could not have stopped the violence and didn't start it. But anyway, that was why the Chicken a la King editorial. Yes?
I anticipate what the other person's talking about. It's all emotion to me.
Well,
But I may be a little ill-informed.
I'm not any better informed than you are, but I see all that as well. And in fact, I'm very disturbed about some of the things going on today, even though I'm not very much involved as I was. Martin Luther King, if you've studied his philosophy of nonviolence, number one, it was always, the violence was out, but demonstration was always the last resort. You've gone through all other means. You protested against a law you felt was unjust, but only the part of the law that you felt was unjust. Next, you always offered reasonable alternatives to what you were protesting against. You just weren't demanding. There was always an alternative. And finally, that you're willing to take the consequences of going to jail. So when you went out, you thought that through, but you were ready to go to jail. And again, that happened. I don't see that happening in a lot of the protesting today. I don't see them having gone through. And it really bothers me when anyone does that in the name of Dr. Martin Luther King, because he was associated with protest. That means I can just protest whenever I want to without any circumstance. He was interested in protest, but as a means, clear means to an action, not just out there. And there are now books out now also talking about the radicalism of the late of King as he got older, and clearly there was some movement in that direction. King died at 39. I hope that whatever I said at 39 is not held forever. As my last word, or today, as my last word on anything. But I'm really, really upset when anyone, to me, the second commandment is using the name of God for human selfish purposes. It is hiding behind the law or some godlike word. And when people say Martin Luther King would have did this or done that, or anybody for that matter, they better study it pretty well. And so I don't like to see protesters out at Graceland trying to discourage people coming to Graceland, so it will take money out of the city at the same time they're asking the city to pay more money to them. I mean, what is this? In the name of Martin Luther King.
I have to be Sandy's proxy and make sure that we all know we're supposed to go to church. Thank you, Dr. Bakke, so much.
Thank you.